About History series, The Unification of Taiwan by the Qing Dynasty.
Welcome to the Explainer. If you're a focused learner who loves digging into the massive, sweeping turning points of world history, well, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're unpacking a moment in time that literally reshaped the map of East Asia. The year is 1683. It's a year completely defined by a single dramatic military surrender, a bitter blood feud, and a massive geopolitical dilemma that forced an entire empire to decide, do we expand our borders into the total unknown, or do we retreat back to safety? By the end of this explainer, you're going to see exactly how the highly calculated choices made over just a few tense months secured the geopolitical reality of East Asia for centuries to come. So we're dropping right into the climax of our story on August 15th, 1683. Think about the number 22 for a second. 22 years. That is exactly how long the Ming-Zheng era lasted in Taiwan. Just imagine an entire regime, right? A stubborn holdout of Ming Dynasty loyalists that spanned 3 generations, from Kangxi all the way down to his grandson, Zheng Chenggong. And then, in a single day, that entire 22-year era just vanished. Zheng Chenggong handed over his absolute most critical possession, the Ming Dynasty seal of the generalissimo who recruits and subdues. With that one highly symbolic gesture, an entire era abruptly came to an end. Chapter 1. The Surrender of Taiwan. You see, this wasn't just some standard military capitulation. It was an incredibly delicate transfer of power negotiated between Zheng Chenggong and the victorious Qing general Shi Lang. Let's actually walk through this whirlwind timeline because it perfectly shows how a military victory transforms into a complex political reality. So on August 15th, the seal is surrendered. And coincidentally, this was right on the Mid-Autumn Festival. When Emperor Kangxi received the joyous news far away, he was reportedly just thrilled by this overseas triumph. Then, just a week later, on August 22nd, General Shi Lang makes a highly anticipated entrance into Koxinga's family temple. And finally, by August 27th, Emperor Kangxi issues a sweeping decree of forgiveness. He promised that, as long as the territory is peacefully surrendered, all past actions will be completely forgiven and the former officials will be accommodated. Chapter 2. Shi Lang's Tears. Let's actually rewind for a second to that middle date from our timeline, August 22nd. General Shi Lang wasn't just some random Qing commander. He had a deep, visceral blood feud with the Zheng family. They had actually executed his father years prior, which brings up a massive historical question. What would you expect him to do? Seriously, put yourself in Shi Lang's shoes for a minute. You've just conquered the island. You now hold the absolute power of life and death over the very people who murdered your father. The entire Taiwanese population was watching him, holding their breath, totally expecting a brutal and bloody revenge. But here's where it gets wild. Shi Lang completely subverted everyone's expectations. He didn't order any executions. Instead, he went straight to the Zheng family temple, the temple of his sworn enemies, and just broke down in tears. He stated publicly that he and the former leader were once like brothers, and that his invasion was strictly a matter of public duty to the state. It was not a personal vendetta. He actually proclaimed, "A true man does nothing more than this." He actively chose his duty as a statesman over his own private enmity. By drawing this hard line between his public mission and his private sorrow, he delivered an absolute masterclass in political reconciliation. And the really crucial takeaway here is the immediate aftermath of that shocking display of restraint. Because of his incredibly strict military discipline, not a single civilian was killed during the takeover. And that isn't just some historical folklore. It was literally inscribed on the pacification stele erected at the Grand Matsu Temple in Tainan. This bloodless transition secured immense, lasting social stability. The people, who honestly didn't even feel like they had suffered the usual ravages of war, were pacified. And that laid an incredibly stable groundwork for what would become 212 years of calm, highly organized Qing rule. Chapter 3. The Great Keep or Abandon Debate. So, the dust settles on this bloodless victory, right? But suddenly, a massive, totally unexpected geopolitical dilemma immediately follows. The Qing Empire had won the island, sure, but they had absolutely no idea what to do with it. This brilliantly illustrates the divide that was happening in the imperial court at the time. On one side, you have the dominant view among the coastal officials, which was simply abandon it. They saw the island as this wild, untamed frontier. They were terrified it would just be a constant drain on resources and a breeding ground for future rebellions. But on the other side, you have General Shi Lang arguing to keep it. He saw the island's absolutely crucial strategic value. Shi Lang was actually so concerned that the court would just abandon the island that he wrote his famous memorial, basically a formal petition to the emperor, on keeping or abandoning Taiwan. He laid out three incredibly powerful arguments. First off, he argued the island is the ultimate shield for the security of several southeastern coastal provinces. Second, he warned that if the Qing leave, hostile forces or foreign powers are absolutely going to occupy it, creating a permanent threat to China's maritime borders. And third, completely contrary to the officials' fears, he pointed out that this was a vast, fertile land stretching thousands of miles, rich with developmental potential. He expertly connected a 17th century argument to timeless concepts of maritime security. Chapter 4: Emperor Kangxi's Decision. So, this intense, high-stakes debate lands squarely on the desk of the ultimate authority. The emperor had literally been watching his ministers argue about this for 8 long months. But here is a fascinating historical interpretation for us to consider. Was this great debate actually just a calculated ruse by Kangxi? Essentially, was he playing a 17th century game of 4D chess? Some historians argue that Kangxi, who was a brilliant strategist, always intended to keep the territory. I mean, think about it. What emperor fights a massive, expensive war just to throw the prize away? Instead, the theory goes, he used the debate as a psychological tool. By letting his ministers argue themselves in circles, he forced them to truly recognize the island's strategic magnitude on their own. So when he finally made his decision, it wasn't just a top-down decree. It was an undeniable, logical conclusion.
Chapter 5: Establishing Prefectures and Counties.
By the spring of the following year, the debate officially ended, and the emperor issued the final decree to firmly incorporate the island into the Qing map. To actually solidify these new borders, the Qing court established a brand new administrative hierarchy. It was structured like this. The island was placed directly under the jurisdiction of Fujian province. Under that, they created Taiwan prefecture. And then that prefecture was divided into 3 counties, Taiwan, Fengshan, and Zuiliu, which, by the way, correspond roughly to modern-day Tainan, Kazhong, and Shai. This structure formally transformed a military conquest into a fully organized, governed society. And the real-world impact of this administrative shift? It was massive, and it was immediate. For years, the Qing had enforced these incredibly strict coastal bans, literally forcing people to move inland to starve out the Zheng regime. Now, with the island finally secured, the seas were opened, the bans were lifted, displaced citizens, people who had lived for years as refugees in their own country, could finally return to their ancestral homes on the coast and start rebuilding their lives. Chapter 6: Echoes of History. You know, looking back, it's really worth reflecting on the contrasting fates of the men who orchestrated this massive pivot. Zheng Chenggong and his officials were relocated to Beijing, where they were given high-sounding but completely empty noble titles, basically living out their days in comfortable captivity. Meanwhile, General Shi Lang returned to Fujian as a celebrated marquis, watching his once-abandoned hometown absolutely flourish with new life. Today, if you visit Shi Lang's memorial, you'll find this really powerful couplet: "Recovering Taiwan for eternity, pacifying Taiwan for eternity." Over 300 years later, the intense, incredibly bitter, personal grievances between Shi Lang and the Zheng family have largely been forgotten by time. But what remains? What remains are the calculated, deeply strategic choices these men made back in 1683. They chose public duty over private vengeance, and they chose strategic foresight over fearful retreat. So I'll leave you with this thought to mull over. When the fog of immediate conflict clears, how often are the borders of our world defined not by the battles we fight, but by the peace we choose to structure afterward? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating pivot of history with me.